Good evening. How are you? Good. I'm very pleased to see such a full room again. Thank you very much for coming. And of course, we have an exciting topic to talk about today. That is Russia and Putin and other related matters. And we have two distinguished visitors who I will introduce to you in a minute. I would just like to remind you that we also have an exciting YouTube channel. And please watch it regularly, and you can also subscribe to it. And of course, we have a website, crusterevents.com, and our mailing list. And if you're not yet on the mailing list, please let us know, and we will sign you up with pleasure. I'm Klaus Lauers, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And today we have Richard Sakwa here, a professor of Russia and Europe at the University of Kent in the UK. Richard is a very well-known expert on Russia and the former Soviet Union and the Cold War and more recent politics. He has written plenty of books, which I will show you two in a minute. He is also affiliated with Chatham House, and he's also a member of the exclusive Valdal Club, I understand, which means he is being invited to travel to Sochi once a year or so, where there are Russian experts who consider the future of Russian foreign policy. And then on the last day of that meeting, President Putin himself tends to make an appearance and tell the assembled experts about his wisdom. And Richard has recently published not just one book, but two books. For example, there is Russia Against the Rest, the Post-Cold War Crisis of World Order. Here is a book, and it's available outside, and I'm sure Richard will be pleased to also sign a copy for you if you want to buy a copy. And then also he has published the book, The Putin Paradox, and that is also available outside. Then we have a second distinguished speaker tonight, that is Ambassador Jack Matlock. And Jack has been here before, twice I think, and he always filled the room, like tonight, so it's a great pleasure to have you back. Ambassador Matlock has the distinction of having been American ambassador to two countries which do not exist anymore. I don't know whether we can call that mission accomplished. He was ambassador to the Soviet Union and ambassador to Czechoslovakia. And he also worked for many years in the State Department. He was second in command at the Moscow embassy. He worked closely with President Reagan. He attended all summits between Reagan and Gorbachev, which in the end ended the Cold War. He came to know Ronald Reagan very well, and he became a personal friend of Mikhail Gorbachev. So it's a great pleasure to have you here again. And of course, after having retired from the Foreign Service, life did not stop for Jack Matlock. He continued teaching and writing. He has written his memoirs, and he has also published a book on the end of the Cold War. So I would like to welcome you, Ambassador Matlock and Professor Sakwa. The way we proceed tonight is that first Richard Sakwa will talk to us and give an insight about his expertise on Russia. Then Ambassador Matlock will respond and tell us about recent developments in Russia. And then the three of us will go to the stage to have a grilling session. I will ask a few questions to the two gentlemen, and then we'll open it up to you and have a very exciting Q&A session, I hope. Please feel encouraged to ask as many interesting questions as possible. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Sakwa.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and it's an enormous pleasure to be here. My first time in North Carolina and first time at this university. So great. As Klaus said, I'm going to talk for a little bit, and I certainly look forward very much to discussion, questions and thoughts later. I will be trying to deal with both topics at the same time. It's going to be rather difficult in half an hour, basically about the rather modest questions about the post-Cold War order and also about the Putin phenomenon. So let's go on that subject. I want to start with a few words about John le Carré, who was recently awarded the Olof Palme Prize in Sweden. And as part of his speech, an acceptance speech for that Olof Palme Prize, he says a lot about Olof Palme and not just the mysterious issues of his death, but the man committed to peace and to precisely the embodiment, if you like, of what we thought would be a new order after the end of the Cold War in 1989. And John le Carré says this about, he introduces him into Smiley's people, and Smiley was obviously one of Olof Palme's people. John le Carré says, when the Cold War ended and the Western world was still congratulating itself, Smiley felt betrayed. So did I. And Palme would also have felt betrayed if he had lived long enough. Where was the promised peace that we'd all been waiting for? Where was the great vision? And that great vision is with a capital G and a capital V. The reconciliation, the nuclear disarmament treaty that Palme had been tirelessly working for. Where was the Marshall Plan that would pull battered nations off their knees? And above all, where was the voice of hope and renewal? Is it too fanciful to imagine that had he lived, Palme would have supplied that voice? I think so. 1989, in the end, turned out to be not what we anticipated. Some people say we always were mistaken to think that something new could emerge because, as Lord Acton had always said, history is just a story of the banality and stupidity of humanity. But, I think it's also perhaps a bit more positive on occasions where there are those moments when there's an idea that a new possibility of global order and indeed domestic order is possible. And unless we fight for it, then it probably certainly won't be. But what my specific point I want to make now is that in the end, 1989 did end reproducing the structures and ideology of that original Cold War. So that's where we went. There's a great literature on that emerging. So it wasn't just about the failure of a new peace order, if you like. It was also about the failure of the ideas of liberalism. It certainly wasn't the end of history, but it was the failure even of the historical fact of the end of the Cold War. There's quite a large literature on this, of course. We just recently, John Mearsheim, a great book, The Liberal Delusion, Ivan Krastyev, Stephen Holmes, The Light That Failed, which is also about the failure of the domestic transformations, Stephen Walt, The Hell of Good Intentions, and the list is rather long. But I'm modestly going to contribute and have contributed to that. The peace promised by 1989 was lost, and we've now once again entered a period of international confrontation accompanied by what some call a second Cold War. Now, I was, and in this book, so please don't quote me against myself, I was a skeptic about the notion of a new Cold War. In recent times, I've become more convinced that something like a Cold War is part of the structure of international politics today. So, in two aspects. The first one is that the second Cold War is part of great power politics and the international world conflict between states today. But why we can specifically talk about a second Cold War is, I make the analogy with the first Cold War and between the First World War and the Second World War. In the Second World War, it was a continuation of the unfinished agenda, the way that the First World War ended with outsider powers, Versailles, and so on. But the actors in the Second World War were different. There was greater emphasis on Japan and the Pacific theatre, just as in the Second Cold War, more focus on China, different actors, different combinations. But some sort of global conflict is taking place, with Russia and China aligning ever more closely on the one side, and, if you like, what we used to call the hegemonic powers, the Atlantic power system, on the other side. I'll say a few more words about that later. But so that's the framework. As for 1989, what I want to do in these few minutes is to say, well, how can we explain it? What sort of concepts, what sort of theorization can we use to explain how we got from there, the glad morning, to this dark evening of conflict today? One way, and there's plenty of ways, I just want to throw a few ideas out. One of them is to suggest a tension between the two models of post-Cold War order. One model I will associate with the date 1989, and the second model 1991, the year of the August coup in 1991, the disintegration of the Soviet Union at the end of that year, and the rebirth of Russia as an independent state at the end of December 1991. So it's a way of conceptualizing it, to say that even at the beginning, at the dawn of the post-Cold War order, two models were already in conflict, the model of 1989 and the model of 1991. Even 1989 has multiple meanings, and it's out of these multiple meanings that some of the new conflicts have emerged. As far as Russia is concerned, 1989 is only part of the story. This is the part in which two major events come about. The first is the renunciation within Russia itself of the Leninist version of revolutionary socialism, and so therefore you had, in 1989, for Russia, was dissolution of the communist order. And the dissolution of that old system ended 2 years before the end of the Soviet Union. And so it was, I call it, and insist on calling it dissolution, and then we had disintegration 2 years later. And dissolution was something that Russia did itself, led by Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, and he himself was only the legatee of a long period of discussion within the Soviet Union. The new political thinking, various institutes, the Academy of Sciences, lots of other people contributed to it, and every time I talk about these things in Moscow, almost every time someone emerges and says, yes, I mentioned, or I was at this institute and they were talking about it. In other words, all the way since the death of Stalin, something had been changing, and the changing gave rise in the end to the new political thinking. And the new political thinking itself represented not just simply a repudiation of Marxist-Leninist visions of class war and international politics. It actually represented a new way of thinking about international politics more widely. And this is often forgotten, that the new political thinking is something, in other words, that isn't just to do with the end of the Soviet Union. It's also to do about the way and thoughts about the nature of international order today. And so we could say, well, what we need is a bit more new political thinking. Obviously, it's not all that popular in certain circles, because the consequence was the end of the Soviet Union, the end of empire, and all sorts of bad things. But it's a different story, which I would argue. So 1989 as the transcendence through a long period of time. Of course, China has a different version of 1989. It was Tiananmen, and at that moment, it was the conflict between the Russian version of of reform communism, of moving forward to humane democratic socialism and beyond. In China, of course, the consolidation of a communism of reform. In other words, the Communist Party stays in charge and leads the reform. So it's very different. So that's 1989 opens the door to something else, to the project of 1991. Now, this project of 1991 isn't just about the Soviet Union disintegrating. It is also Russia's democratic revolution. We all remember, those of us of a certain vintage, how events in August 1991 and the huge popular mobilization, the democratic sense of the time. And this is something which hasn't died. That the project of 1991 as Russia as not just a humane democratic state, but now just simply a democratic state, that 1991 impetus at the foundation of the modern independent Russian state still exists. It's still there as part of the part of the discursive framework of that system. So that's the tension, therefore, between two models, 1989, 1991, two visions of what sort of order should happen afterwards. I don't want to talk too much about 1989, but just simply to say that 1989 ultimately established a dynamic of politics which was, that particular 1989 was appropriated, if you like, into the discourse of the Atlantic power system of we used to call it the West, but I'm now talking more and more about a post-Atlantic West, which is a different thing. But of the Atlantic power system, which in that time between 1989 and 91 transformed itself to, and it started calling itself the liberal international order. Until 1989, that term had hardly ever been used, just like globalization. If you look in the indexes of books published before 1989, you'll hardly ever see it. And suddenly, after 1989, it was everywhere, the discussion. What that signals, as far as I'm concerned, is that 1989 became radicalized. With all of its, it became radicalized, but what was radicalizing was not a new vision. It was the old vision in more radical forms. And that was, 1989, as many people have said, is astonishing for its lack of ideological innovation or even ideas, new ideas, and its lack of institutional innovation. For example, there was a lot of talk at the end of the Cold War of establishing a European Security Council within the framework of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, of the Helsinki process. All of that was stopped. All that we had instead was the dynamic of enlargement of an existing system, rather than what Gorbachev, new political thinkers, and lots of others also, by the way, because that project of new political thinking also had its Western counterparts. Just the peace movements of the 1980s were particularly important against the cruise and Pershing missiles. There was also today, but that long tradition of peace movements wasn't just about nuclear things. It was also early stirrings of the environmental movement, that the new political thinking which said that we have to rethink the way that international politics is done, and that also means we need to rethink some of our domestic arrangements. Instead of which, we have 1989, which suppresses these sources of innovation. Maybe it's outside of things, but even the point at which I've just been reading a book about East Germany, and Klaus Offer, for example, always has argued the speed with which German unification took place was, and it was deliberate. Maybe there's lots of other factors involved, but one of them was to prevent a humane democratic socialism emerging in East Germany, which could have offered an alternative model of development. Interestingly enough, that specific East German vision of 1989 is still powerful. 30 years after unification, you talk to even a younger generation in East Germany. We have one in our staff at the University of Kent, and she's absolutely adamant that even today, that East Germans look at politics differently, and I'm not just talking about voting for AfD and things like that. But I think I'm more positive. UK is the other side of that. But such like. So it's 1989, in other words, failed to become have within it, if you like, what the French would call a pouvoir constituant. It didn't have that sense of a founding moment of a new order. So a founding moment. So it was simply an expansive. It became enlargement, and of course we then saw the institutional enlargement of the European Union and NATO. I won't go into all the other details, but the 1989 we can continue, and I do just a critique of that. This then takes us, just a few words before I move on to Putin, is 1991 is also a deeply flawed revolution. I've suggested it's a democratic revolution, but again, the question of how Russia would move into post-communist modernity has still not been resolved. That there's still some fundamental questions about what would happen. Yes, 1991 for Russia was both a political, but above all, a geopolitical question, and ultimately it was a geopolitics which trumped the sources of domestic renewal. All sorts of elements there where we can look at the cultural contradictions of post-communism. That I've suggested that the cultural logic of Cold War was reproduced, but the cultural logic of post-communism ties back to the longer history of Russian attempt to become modern, of modernization, with all of the same questions which faces Turkey at an earlier point, Kemalism, and was one answer to it, of a post-Leninist order within Russia. I was going to persecute people, and I think you're going to get away with it. I was going to use René Girard and mimesis and mimetic revolution, but I'm not going to do it the way that democracy in many ways is one of the most mimetic of elements, because just one word, René Girard, when he talks about mimetic conflict and scapegoating, and obviously Russia has become the scapegoat in a Girardian sense quite profoundly, that it happens not when the object not of desire but of conflict and hatred is closer to you than when it was more distant. And in many ways this helps explain why Russia in the post-communist years has been, certainly in the Russiagate allegations of 2016, has been particularly intensely demonized, because it's just close enough to us to be recognizable, yet it's distant enough and alien enough to make it an object of hatred. And it's this is the sort of argument I would say is the cultural logic of the Second Cold War is no longer ideological in terms of capitalism versus socialism, but it's part of this intense mimetic rivalry between twins who are similar, United States and Russia, but which are just different enough, close enough to hate each other, but different enough to maintain that tension in the long term. So this is some thoughts, if you like, on how the Second Cold War developed. But in the larger framework, so you have this logic of enlargement instead of transformation, meeting an irresistible force in Moscow saying, enlargement, NATO, EU, it needs to be negotiated. It needs to be part of a larger settlement, and that larger settlement was not achieved at the end of the Cold War. A new peace order in Europe. I mean, there's lots of issues involved in that. Some people would say that instead of having a Jean Monnet-style enlargement of the EU, for example, we should perhaps have had a more David Mitriani-style functionalism. To rebuild that peace order in Europe, maybe we should have dealt, as the European Union did, in its early forms, say a coal and steel community or an atomic energy, Euratom, to extend it more closely, and functionally build up trust, instead of which the logic of enlargement became absolutely primary, and then we get to where we are today. So this takes us ultimately to the Putin paradox. Because my fundamental argument will be that out of all of these contradictions, we have the Putin phenomenon is in many ways a result of that. Why is it paradoxical? Well, I was asked this the other day. Can you say in one sentence why? What is the Putin paradox? Well, this is the toughest. I could do it in 100,000 words, I can tell you, but to do it in one sentence is much harder. I think it was Mark Twain who wrote once, I'm sorry, I didn't have time to write a shorter letter So in this case, again. But ultimately, I suppose one of the many paradoxes is that how come that Putin, in the end, the most pro-Western leader, and I will insist on this, that Putin, the most pro-Western leader Russia has ever had, ended up as an antagonist of that Western order. And so this is a paradox and how it became possible. Now, I think just very briefly, I'd like to suggest, and we can put this into context, of what happened after 1991. And I'm going to suggest 4 phases for Russian foreign policy. And my argument is that these 4 phases continue, they're both chronological, and at the same time, they exist synchronously at the same time. And these 4 phases, very briefly, are as follows. The first one, 1991 to 1995, and extremely, most of you know this, a very pro-Western and pro-Atlantic time. Yeltsin was even talking about joining NATO. All these things were going on. So this early 1991 to 1995, enthusiastic pro-Westernism, that finally, communism is over, the obstacle is over, and so on. As many at the time said quickly, understood quickly, or rather rapidly, that the target may well have been communism, but for some in the West, the question remained Russia as a great power. Brzezinski's famous article of 1994, that Russia and Ukraine must be kept apart, because if they come together, then Russia will emerge and the empire will be established. So even this first phase was difficult. And if you remember, it was in 1994 that Yeltsin talked about the cold peace. A cold peace as defined as an order which hasn't resolved the fundamental questions. And so even the most pro-Westernizers in this first phase understood that there were issues that hadn't been resolved. The second phase of Russian foreign policy is from 1996 to 1999, and it was headed by the one man who is universally admired across the political spectrum, and that is Yevgeny Primakov. He was foreign minister from January 1999 to September 1998, then prime minister until May 1999. Primakov talked about multipolarity. He talked about a Russia-India-China alignment, going on to principles of non-aligned movement. He also talked about Russia, defending Russia's interests, and so on. So Primakov, ultimately this phase of competitive coexistence, in many ways repudiated some of the new political thinking and went back to Khrushchev in the 1950s. Then we have the third phase. Putin comes in the year 2000, and he says, we can do better than that. And this is a phase I call the new realism, 2000 to 2012. Periodization is important when you try to discuss these things. That in these years, Putin, of course, famous speech in the Bundestag just after 9/11, in which he talks about Russia's destiny as part of Europe and this whole vision of new continentalism. And then, after the invasion of Iraq, many other incidents, and his famous speech in Munich in February 2007, in which my argument is that the spirit of that Bundestag speech, that pro-Western speech, was still there. The tone, though, was of disappointment. And he actually says, and he said this many times since then, just listen to us, and then we can maybe work our way out. He said this recently again. Let's just get together and talk and dialogue and do diplomacy. So 2000 to the year 2012 is a single period of increasing disappointment, yet trying to find ways in which this post-Cold War order, a more cooperative one, could be established. And that is, in my view, and Dmitry Trenin's and others, that why Medvedev was chosen as the interim leader, if you like, between 2008 and 2012, when Putin wasn't allowed to have a third term, because he was the most liberal of all options. Maybe Putin was saying to himself, look, I can't work with the West, maybe Medvedev can do it. And of course Medvedev did come up with this idea in June 2008 of a new European security order. And of course, that also was politely dismissed. So this then led on in 2012. Putin comes back, and he is a much more embittered Putin. He says allegedly, somebody said to me, he was saying, look, doing international politics with, he mentioned the United States, so please don't be upset. He says it's like playing chess with a pigeon. The pigeon runs about the board, makes a mess of things, knocks the pieces over, and then declares victory. Not very nice image, but certainly it was reflective of a person who is disappointed rather than angry. And this leads on to the fourth and final phase in which we are now of Russian neo-revisionism, which is basically neo-revisionist because the argument and the assertion is never to destroy the international system as it is established, because the international system as established after 1945 had the Soviet Union and China as founder members, and obviously permanent members of the Security Council. So they are not revisionist powers, despite what various strategies and doctrines have recently said. A revisionist power is out to destroy the international system. Russia and China are not. They, of course, don't like the way the system works, and that's what's neo-revisionist. It's about challenging the existing balance of power or hegemony in the order rather than the system itself. So, as we can argue, in a sense, they don't like the software, the order idea, the world order system, but the system itself, the hardware, they're not out to destroy. So that's four phases of Russian foreign policy. And in my view, Putin is still loyal in many ways to all four simultaneously. The thing about Putin is that he will never close an option completely. That each of these options takes shares in the making of policy today, but none dominates. The Western, the Eastern, various other options, but they're all there as potential paths, and so therefore the door is open. One fundamental path which still is on the agenda is this tension which after 1989 was a fundamental one, and that was the tension between Atlanticism and European pan-continentalism. This is a fundamental structuring issue. In 1989, if you remember, even when the big discussions about German unification took place, the old Gaullist, Mitterrandist idea of some sort of pan-continental federation, confederation came back. This idea of some sort of pan-European vision in which Russia would become gradually acculturated, and we would have Turkey as well in all of this. These are ideas that were mentioned, but were all at various points not developed. But instead of which we had Atlanticism, the US-European alignment, which was by definition, it's obviously delivered to NATO, you could argue, many public goods. That it certainly has. But the question is, was it at a certain point redundant? And is it time to move beyond that? Now, one doesn't have to be a Trumpian to suggest that NATO may be obsolete. This is quite clearly an issue on the agenda. And just putting it forwards to say that there were two models of European politics today, the continentalist one and the Atlanticist one. And the gulf is growing ever larger between these two. That's why I'm suggesting that we could be moving to a post-Atlantic West. And if that is the case, then that opens up the way to reclaim some of that potential of 1989. I just want to quote one article which was in the New York Times just yesterday. And this was the failure of European defiance. In other words, this ability to establish what we thought European Union would lead to, and establish Europe as an international subject of politics, as an independent actor. We all believed that. That was one of the great promises of 1989. that the hour of Europe has struck. I think later on was the way it was defined. And this is a marvellous article, written more in sorrow than in anger. The failure of European defiance, in particular over the the Iran nuclear deal, the failure of Europe's ability to keep that deal going, the JCPOA. But it's also about other things, that, and so it ends up basically saying that how come 25 years after the Cold War, Europe is still more marginalised than it ever was, that it's still overlain by the international politics of others, that Russia on the one side, China increasingly, United States, and how come it hasn't been able to get its act together in these 25, if not 30 years. And I think that is the question which we come to. So final point, it seems that history moves in 30-year cycles, 30, 40-year cycles, and the ideas of 1989 ultimately are back on the agenda of how to establish an inclusive and mutual security policy or framework for Europe and indeed for the world. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
I think Professor Sakwa has given us a really brilliant description of how a very hopeful situation has degenerated into something that we're calling the Second Cold War. But except in many of the attitudes on both sides, I see very little actual justification for the policies that we're following today as compared with those during the Cold War. The Cold War was basically about communism and its confrontation with, we might call it both capitalism and democracy. And it did require, I believe, the opposition of the United States and the attempt to avoid the spread of what they call socialism, communism by force, based upon the ideology that this was the future, the Marxist-Leninist ideology that history was driven by class struggle, and that the ultimate class struggle would be by the proletariat removing and eliminating the bourgeoisie, which would then make the government totally unnecessary and everybody would live in a paradise. That's what the Cold War was about, and the Cold War ended. The Cold War ended definitively at least 2 years, probably 3 years before the Soviet Union broke up. Why today you will hardly find a commentator who doesn't refer to our victory in the Cold War? This is a fundamental misconception. We ended the Cold War by mutual agreement in the interests of both countries and all the others. And it was done by negotiation. And it was done precisely because Mikhail Gorbachev, who was then in control of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, had decided that the future is not with this confrontation, and the future is not with Marxism-Leninism and a government that enforces its will by force on its subjects, but by evolving a democratic process and living in what he called our common European home. As he changed his aims and the leadership, we were able, in a period of just 2 to 3 years, to solve almost every problem we had in the Cold War with the Soviet Union and to solve it in the interest of both countries. I think that so much of our commentary today is based upon a total misunderstanding of how we ended the Cold War. Between, I would say, 1987 and 1991, not simply one geopolitical change came about, but three. They were almost simultaneous, but they were separate, and they, I think, were widely misunderstood because almost nobody anticipated how this was going to work out. The first was the end of the Cold War. And that ended philosophically, not in '89, but in '88. And I would say when Gorbachev made his speech to the United Nations in December 7, 1988, and rejected explicitly the Marxist-Leninist class struggle as a basis for foreign policy, but rather a policy of creating a common European home, that is, cooperation despite ideology, that ended the Cold War, philosophically. Europe was still divided, and the division of Europe ended in '89, a very crucial one, just as crucial as Professor Sakwa has pointed out. But what happened after that? The Cold War ended, and then the second, I call them geopolitically seismic events, was the end of Communist Party control of the Soviet Union. That didn't end because of Western pressure. That didn't end because of Western demands. Yes, we thought communism was a lousy system. But when I was working for President Reagan, who obviously condemned communism repeatedly, I mean, our attitude was, look, this is a crazy system, but if that's what they want, that's their business. What we have to worry about is they're imposing it on others. They stopped imposing it on others, and in fact, Gorbachev, once the Cold War was over, once the pressures from that were over, he was free to try to liberate his own country internally from the dictatorship of the Communist Party. One of the great ironies, I would say, perhaps of history, is that the person who had the most to do with removing communist control of the Soviet Union was the then leader of the Communist Party. And I would ask you, to think about that, because it's a number of implications, but that is the case. He didn't remove communist rule in the Soviet Union because we had demanded it. If we had demanded it, he couldn't have done it. He did it because he was convinced that was necessary for his own country's development. Around 90, 91, he would say in private, I never heard him say this publicly then, this is a country which has always been ruled top-down. But if we look at the world today, the dynamic countries, the ones that are moving forward, are ruled bottom-up. So my task is turning Russian history upside down. But he said, we can't do this overnight. It's going to take time. And he was certainly right about that. But the fact is that by 1991, because of reforms that Gorbachev tricked, in effect, the party into assuming, the Communist Party had lost the ability to control the thing. And then by 91, in December, when with very little actual violence, this great empire fell apart into 15 independent countries. This was done entirely for internal reasons. People now talk as if that was a victory in the Cold War, our victory. It wasn't. It wasn't, and we did not want the Soviet Union to break up for a lot of reasons. I don't have time to explain them all now, and we did what we could to try to support Gorbachev's effort to create a voluntary federation of 12 republics. Yes, we thought the 3 Baltic countries should get their independence. We would have been very happy to have the other 12 stay in a voluntary federation, as President Bush told the Ukrainian parliament on August 1st, 1991. So we have these 3, I would say, geopolitically seismic events. Seismic because it's almost like continents separating or clashing, taking place within about 3 years. And the perception of so many people, much of this was totally unexpected, not predicted, that the end of the Cold War, it ended in '91 with the breakup of the Soviet Union. There is a multi-part documentary that was released, I think, in the mid-'90s, shown on CNN, probably BBC, and others, which has the Cold War ending as the Russian flag replaces the communist flag on the Kremlin. When I was shown a preview of that by the producer, I said, look, the Cold War had been over at least 2 years before that happened. How can you make that the end of the Cold War? And he said, oh, well, it's much more dramatic to make it that way. So I said, okay, you're doing drama, not history. So what come next? Remember Francis Fukuyama's end of history? Suddenly it is proclaimed that what has happened has proved that the future is for capitalism and democracy. That's going to be the future of everybody. You know, that strikes me as precisely making the same mistake that Karl Marx made when he predicted a future of socialism based upon certainty that were going to happen. And yet, that has been the basis of what we have followed ever since then. We won the Cold War, we're the only superpower. But wait a minute. What do you mean by superpower? Does it mean you can destroy everything? We can. Soviet Union could. Russia can. Is that what you want? Does power to destroy give you the power to transform other societies? Does it give you the right to write the rules? I think we have to do a lot of thinking, because if there were 2 superpowers between the Soviet Union and the United States, I would have to say that we didn't do a great job of running the world. Sure, we could destroy everything if we got things out of hand. And that remains today, if that's your definition. So is the future one of competition between various systems? Does it depend upon which country can control more countries than the other? So much of geopolitical analysis seems to be based upon that, forgetting that that is precisely what has created 2 world wars, and in a nuclear age it's unthinkable that it should happen again. So I think that we need to think much more carefully about how we perceive the world. I know Professor Sakwa has mentioned 1989, I would say 1991, we were at that point where I think there was a possibility of creating not a world that is going to be peaceful everywhere, but a world where the conflicts could be at least contained and minimized, but not by a single power, not by the United States, in effect declaring that its sphere of influence is the whole world, and nobody else has a right to any sphere of influence. I just read today an article by Graham Allison in Foreign Affairs, which takes up this whole issue of the concept of a sphere of influence. And I would say that, you know, what would you think of a person who would say, I don't have to pay any attention to laws of gravity. We never pass laws like that. Let's ignore it. And I'll tell you, the concept of sphere of influence for states in terms of not wishing to have a threat on their border and using whatever means it takes to keep that from happening is as much a law of nature as the laws of gravity. And if we ignore them, as we have been, we are going to get into the situation we are today, which makes no sense. What are the real threats of us today? The security threats. The long run, certainly climate change. Dealing with epidemics. How, without cooperation, are we going to deal with these things? Terrorism, particularly if the terrorists get weapons of mass destruction. All of these things require cooperation and cooperation of the largest powers. And there's no one pattern that fits everything. And unless we begin to respect the fact that countries like Russia and China and India, they're going to go their own way, they're going to develop things differently, and our attempts somehow to force people into a system that we imagine we have here, I think has led us to the deterioration at home of our own politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these very insightful comments by Professor Sakwa and Ambassador Matlock. What I found interesting is that Richard Sakwa said that he has increasingly come to the conclusion that we can or should speak of something like a new Cold War, while Ambassador Matlock has rejected this notion. I need to ask you, defend your position. Richard first, why do you think there is a new Cold War? In brief, please.
I mean, I actually say it's a second Cold War, which doesn't, precisely because it's not new, which would assume it was a continuation of the old one. I actually think that in part it is because of the incomplete end of the old one, but the second Cold War is more localized than the first one. There's many differences between the first and the second Cold War. By using the notion of a second Cold War, we're actually pointing out what's different as much as we're talking about what was similar. And so it's not the old ideology of socialism versus capitalism and so on. But it's about great power politics. But one element of this great power politics, so it isn't just normal pre-1914 great power politics, but it's with a peculiar twist. It's of great power politics still embedded in the structures of that first Cold War, which is obviously NATO, the way that this Atlantic power system, which served its functions very well, as you say, in the end, and indeed. And in many ways, even you could say today, NATO and this alliance will still have a purpose in the sense it stops the small states squabbling, and it means one of the conditions of joining NATO is to stop border disputes and so on. So there's a positive element there. But the negative is that it's actually perpetuating both the ideology and the militarization and the structures which were left over from the first conflict, and it's now being imported back into elements of international politics. But it's not, it excludes China, it includes India, so therefore it's unfortunately, I was going to say our, but I've forgotten where I am, but when I'll be back home, it would be our European continent, unfortunately, has not been able to shed that legacy of the Cold War.
Thank you very much. A second Cold War, do you agree?
I think I agree with everything Professor Sakwa has said. My point was not that we're not acting today the way we did during the Cold War. We are. My point was that probably the first Cold War was unavoidable. The second was very avoidable. And it has been, I think, a very much a disappointment for those of us who participated in ending the Cold War to see policies adopted since then that are the antithesis of the policies we used to end the Cold War. So my basic point is not that we're not acting the way we did before in many respects, using the same instruments such as NATO, but that it is not only unnecessary but very dangerous for us to go down this route again.
Okay, thank you very much. I also noticed you said that, Professor Sakwa, you said that Putin was the most Western-oriented Russian politician ever. What about Boris Yeltsin?
Yeah, can I just say, just to finish on that, I agree with what Ambassador Matlock has said, that in other words, we may actually call this second one the unnecessary Cold War, and I agree 100%. It's totally pointless, and that's where we can come to Putin, because quite clearly, I don't think Yeltsin was, certainly in politics, Yeltsin was exceptionally pro-Western, but even he had his doubts at many moments. If you remember the fantastic memoirs of Strobe Tolbert, which I'm sure you've all looked at, the Russia Hand, in which he complains, look, being an ally of the United States is probably worse than being an enemy, because at least you knew where you were, but you're being hugged to death, as it were. I mean, this is Yeltsin saying in some of the recently disclosed Clinton Yeltsin correspondence. So yes, he was, but ultimately Yeltsin was an old-fashioned party apparatchik. He was a party boss in Sverdlovsky. The way he was working was utterly Byzantine. The way that, and ultimately, when he would say that his attempt to achieve liberal capitalism in Russia was forced through in Bolshevik ways. And so, absolutely right, it was top down. So what he didn't allow was that democratic moment, if you like, of 1991, where we had, if you remember, massive civic engagement, civil society, new parties, freedom in the media, and so on. All of that, very quickly, certainly he didn't institutionalize his power in that democratic movement. And instead of which, he then ruled like an old-fashioned party boss, but with the opposite signal than what he was before. So not pro-Western, whereas Putin is of a different generation. Those who met him, including Kissinger, for example, in the 1990s, and other Americans, would say that, one of the, there's much debate about this, but when he was working with Anatoly Sobchak in St. Petersburg, and one reason why I say he's pro-Western is, of course, that he was the first leader, serious leader, who came from St. Petersburg, a thoroughly westernized city, and his consciousness and everything was westernized. That in his time working with a liberal mayor of St. Petersburg, he was working about attracting foreign investment and so on. Certainly Putin's Westernism is certainly with Russian characteristics, but nevertheless.
Thanks very much.
I'm not a partisan of Putin because I do think that a number of his policies have been detrimental to his own people. But I find it very curious that our conventional wisdom that we will hear from our government officials, from much of our media, is that We have democracy and Putin doesn't. We have the second president that took office having received a minority of votes, and one who is running with probably just a little over 41% if he's got that approval. Russia has a president that, even though there may have been some irregularities, was re-elected overwhelmingly, and even polls, most of them will indicate that he still has the support of majority of Russians. So for the US to keep saying, well, he's the problem, I think we are deeply mistaken in thinking that way. One thing, if you're looking at it as Russians, yes, if you are those Democrats with a little d who were not able to prevail in the elections, and many of them came to the West, many of them came out with golden parachutes. After all, for the most part, Putin has not executed his enemies the way Stalin would have, or sent them to Siberia the way the other Soviet leaders before Gorbachev would, but has let them come out to the West.
Well, there have been plenty of poisoners. There have been plenty of attempts to poison people, both in Russia and abroad.
From a Russian standpoint, though, he took on a country which is bankrupt, and not only paid off all the debts. Remember, in the 90s, we were insisting that Russia pay off all of the Soviet debts, the debts that we had tried to keep them from running up because they were importing things we didn't want. Well, but Russia had to pay it off. He did. And after a decade of near chaos, he brought a certain order to the country. And right now, Russia has a trade surplus. It has also a foreign currency surplus. So physically speaking, he is running a very tight ship, while the United States is running up a deficit now approaching $1 trillion a year and piling up its debt. So he has preserved, I would say, one of the most important freedoms that Gorbachev finally introduced, and that is the freedom to travel. I lived 11 years altogether in the Soviet Union, and I know the depressing effect of being cooped up and only a tiny minority being able to leave at all, and not even having totally free travel within the country. So it's not a case that Russia has gone back to the sort of totalitarianism that it experienced under communism. So for us to sit in judgment as our own politics deteriorates, I find, quite frankly, rather shameful.
Okay, thank you. But it is, of course, correct that Putin did annex Crimea in 2014 and at least conducted hybrid warfare in eastern Ukraine. And that is the reason for recent tension between the West and Russia. So the question is, how can that tension be resolved and be overcome? Wouldn't Putin, who did the invasion, wouldn't he have to give something and to make concessions rather than to insist on keeping Crimea and also, trying to obtain control over eastern Ukraine?
Do you want to go first, or shall
you go ahead?
Well, first of all, let me say that when speaking of Crimea, Putin used the legal precedent that we set when we separated Kosovo from Serbia with an illegal war. The UN did not authorize the war against Serbia. Well over 1,000 people were killed in that war. And when we, I believe in 2008, recognized Kosovo as an independent country, which it is not totally because it still has to be policed by outsiders, we violated a commitment under the Helsinki Final Act whereby borders should not be changed without mutual agreement. That is a precise legal precedent, if we want to talk about it, for what Putin did in Crimea. But it is a difference. What happened in Crimea was that it was annexed after a referendum, not a totally free referendum, but one. The vote was maybe 96%, probably should have been more like 75%. There is no question that the majority of the people in the Crimea preferred to be in Russia because they were Russians and because the Ukrainian government had been forcing Ukrainianization on them. Therefore that occurred without a single casualty and with the consent of the people involved. So I say, well, where is the principle of self-determination? Does it apply to everybody except Russians? Many of the Russians would say that's the way it is being applied. Now, I think this was a big mistake, and I think that Putin has created for Russia an irredentist claim that Ukraine will continue to make. I don't see politically how any Russian leader is going to totally back down from that. Now, when we get to the eastern Ukraine, I think we have said, and others have said, oh, he invaded Ukraine. First of all, Putin did not invade Ukraine the way the United States invaded Iraq. We invaded the country, took it over, put in a government, which is giving us problems now, to be sure. Lost nearly 5,000 of our lives of our own people and God knows how many of others. A country that was across the world from us. Yes, Putin has supported a rebellion in the Donbass, a rebellion powered by local people, and he's done it largely by sending irregulars in. Very much analogous to the way we have introduced our military into Syria without the Syrian government approval. You know, this is not an invasion. If they had invaded Ukraine, their military would be sitting in Kiev and they would be dictating who sits in who sits in the government. So I'm saying, let's be a little fair there. Now, how is this going to be solved? First of all, I don't think it's going to be solved until the Ukrainian government is willing to adopt a federal constitution. It is a very divided country, and they have had a unitary government. The violence in 2016 began in the West, not on the Russian side. And our support for military support, I think, and also the EU policies have actually exacerbated the crisis. I think it could have been solved earlier without our involvement. Now, I don't know whether Professor Sakwa agrees with me. He has written about Crimea very perceptively.
Richard, over to you.
I mean, I think that broadly I do agree. The big picture is I think that the Ukrainian crisis is a symptom of what we were talking about earlier. It's a symptom of that failure to establish an inclusive and just post-Cold War order of the sort which you say there was a potential for at the end of the Cold War. And therefore, we had, over the years, a declining a relationship between Moscow and the West. It was going down, ups and downs basically, but basically a downward trend which culminated in 2014 in this this awful crisis which no one wanted, but which was almost at the same time inevitable. It was inevitable because of the clash of integrations. The EU was developing, a deeper relationship. There's potential always, even though NATO enlargement was not on the agenda at that time, there's specific maybe US use of the base. So it was a symptom rather than the cause. Yes, the annexation or the transfer of Crimea was a revisionist act, but it was not, it was obviously against international law, even though national self-determination does factor into it. But it was not part, and I insist on this, on Russia's revisionist strategy. And that's a fundamental category of misunderstanding. Ukraine was a one-off, if you like. It was also geopolitical because of Sevastopol. And I've talked to a lot of people about this in Russia. Putin, remember, he had the Sochi Winter Olympics. We're really looking forward to, good things happening. He was very upset by the boycott by most Western leaders of the Sochi Olympics, which had invested so much hopes involved. And then the last days of it, you have what they call the coup in Kiev, which was an illegitimate government, odious, but nevertheless legitimate, which with Victoria Nuland's and others' support was overthrown. And then you have a sequence. And obviously Crimea for Russia is very, very special. I've been many, many times, and when even sometimes in the 90s to early 2000s, you'd see the Ukrainian flag over Sevastopol. One always did a double take. I remember the discussions in the autumn of 1991 that when the Soviet Union disintegrated, one of the key issues at the moment in December 1991, when this Commonwealth of Independent States was established, was the status of Crimea, and in particular the status of Sevastopol as a city of all Union significance. When Crimea was transferred to Ukraine in 1954, Sevastopol was always in the Soviet constitution called a city. So when Russia, as a continuous state with all the legal obligations of the Soviet Union, technically, in December 1991, Sevastopol should have reverted back to Russia. No one talks about this, but it's quite clear that was the case. And of course there was a referendum in January 1992. But the point was, at the founding act, Bielorussia, in the Minsk agreements, the only way that Ukraine was ever accepted Ukrainian independence was a common military command of the Commonwealth of Independent States. A fellow called Shaposhnikov was put in charge, which meant that, and Kravchuk, the leader of Ukraine at the time, said, well, it doesn't really matter anymore, all of this, whether Sevastopol is this way or Russian or Ukrainian, because we have a single CIS military command. That was absolutely essential. That was the condition. Because at that time, everybody said Ukraine can become independent, but it cannot take Sevastopol. So the condition, but immediately after independence, that was forgotten and reneged on. And understandably, they all established national armies in 1992. And then Sevastopol became this issue, which wasn't going to disappear. One can go on a lot, but just one final point on that. If in 2014, and people say this, had not acted over the Crimea, initially the plan was just Sevastopol. If it had not acted, people will say, it would have been the biggest defeat of Russia in 1,000 years. To have, in a sense, this jewel of Russian military from Catherine the Great and so on, the symbol, if you like, of Russian existence as a great power. And to fall, it's not NATO at that moment, it would have been the United States. And we know already there had been military exercises of US forces in the Crimea, which at one stage, in 2008, if I'm not mistaken, they were chased away by local people with pitchforks. And so then they actually had to abort an exercise. So I know Crimean people. As for just one final thing, on the Donbass, Putin was dragged into it against his will. It was never a plan. If you remember, plenty of evidence for this, the Geneva talks in April 2014, and then there was a referendum in what now became the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics. And Putin opposed it, 11th of May 2014. He always was very, very cautious, and if you remember what people were talking about, Novorossiya and the Russian Spring, and many of these people were saying, today in Donetsk, tomorrow in Moscow. He understood that this mobilization of nationalism of Russian ethnicized nationalism was a huge danger to himself. And so therefore he then within Russia quite severe against Russian nationalists who were saying, take this battle, we start in Donetsk and we march to Moscow. That was the talk at the time, and he understood, and so he was very cautious. And to this day, Minsk is all about returning, quite rightly in my view, Donetsk back to Ukrainian sovereignty. That is how it should be. That's the way forwards.
Thank you.
May I just add one thing? You know, I'm almost certain that if President Obama had been willing to go to the Sochi Olympics and had simply taken Putin aside and said, look, Vlad, there's a lot of talk about Ukraine and NATO. Be assured Ukraine is not going to be part of NATO. Just bear with us. He never, I believe, would have taken Crimea.
Okay.
Thank you. Let me ask a final question before opening it up. What actually is Putin's long-term objective? Internally, we have a weak economy, we have oppression of the opposition, we have also the attempts at the lives of opposition leaders by poison, both within Russia and, like in the UK, outside Russia. Externally, we see Russia now in the Middle East, very deeply involved in the terrible Syrian civil war, and in other countries. We have the Ukraine problem, which we just discussed. So what is his long-term objective? Is it simply recognition again as a great power, or is it a bit more complex?
I think I agree with the idea that he is not trying to revise the international system. Look at the map and look at Russia's vulnerabilities. The danger of terrorism coming out of a Syria or Iraq dominated by ISIS is much greater to Russia than it is to the United States. And yet our policies, starting with the invasion of Iraq and then the support of the so-called Arab Spring, as if it was going to automatically bring democracy and would have our support, when, except in Tunisia, it has brought reactions. And then our attempt, which actually started, I believe, around 2008, to remove Assad. At first surreptitiously, it never stopped, and then openly. I mean, to have, and yet the people we're supporting were totally unable to take over, and to the degree you weakened the Assad government, which yes was brutal, you opened the road to ISIS and the terrorists, which were going to, many of them came from the former Soviet Union, Russia itself. You know, this was a vital interest to Russia. The idea that they had no stake there is absolutely absurd. So what has happened? Actually, if Assad and that regime had collapsed, I think you would have had no way effectively to keep ISIS from essentially controlling the area. Quite honestly, I think the Russians have done us a service in turning that around, because our policy was going to turn it into another morass. But I don't know whether you agree with me on this or not.
So do we have to be grateful to Russia for getting involved in Syria?
Well, I think he got us out of a difficulty, just like he did at the end of the NATO bombing of Serbia, when he sent Primakov to have the deal with Milosevic. So no, I agree completely with that. As for Putin's larger strategy, this is the great the paradox of it. I mean, it goes all the way back to his Millennium Manifesto of December 1999, when it was quite clear that, I mean, the four Putins, which I sort of outlined in the 4 phases of foreign policy, were there. But Putin's big idea was to make Russia a normal state, just a normal state, another actor in international politics, nothing special. He actually said it explicitly, and when he was attending G8 summits in the early years, he said, just don't treat us as a basket case as there was in the 1990s, but don't treat us, as some sort of ogre, the Russian bear coming. No, we're just wanting to be treated a normal great power. But of course, can you have a normal great power in a system where the thing after 1989, which changes symbolically, because indeed 1988 and so on, 1989 meant the establishment of a type of universalism. The Atlantic power system, calling itself the liberal international order, makes this false claim to be global universal, a global Monroe doctrine, which means there can be no spheres of influence. So this is the tragedy of Putin, if you like, that this man who wanted Russia to be treated as a normal power ultimately makes it very abnormal, both internally abnormal and externally. I won't go on about this poisoning thing because I think that's all, there's lots of counter arguments can be made about that. Let's not go there. But so I'm happy to talk about it. But it's just to. I think we need to, because it's the Skripal case is so full of indeterminacies. It's not clear who was doing what to whom. But even so, the fact of abnormality is there because the Russian state today, and I'd quote Bismarck on this, I don't agree. It's never, as Bismarck would say, it's never as strong as it thinks it is, or it's never as weak as we think it is. It's not so weak. The economy, yes, it's got elements of stagnation, a failure to invest adequately. Investment rate this year, or last year, was 20.4%. Minimum needs of 25 to get the economy going. Nevertheless, it's a macroeconomic stability is there to the point of rigidity. Inflation is down. You talked about budget surpluses. It has $534 billion in foreign exchange reserves. Some of it $100 billion in gold. But so this is not the sign, as what people call it, a Putin's kleptocracy. If Russia was a kleptocracy, that money would now be in Swiss bank accounts. It wouldn't be in reserves. And the fact is, the problem, and this is why this government change took place from Medvedev to Mishustin on the 15th of January. It was, let's finally spend some of this money on development, on infrastructure, and so on. So Putin, as I said, has been macroeconomically conservative to the point of dogmatism. People like Kudrin and others are saying, look, let's spend it. Mishustin is actually quite an amazing technocrat in all of this. I remember years ago when you tried to register a property, and he was in charge of the state property registration things way back in 2006 to 2008. And he absolutely transformed it. And Russia is a global model of how to do these things. And then later, in terms of tax, as when he was head of the tax service from 2010 onwards, and he's introduced some things. For example, every till or transaction in real time goes into a central computer. So you never actually have to work out your taxes because if you're a small business and so on, because it's in real time, they know exactly what's going on. A bit of investment, but everybody's happy with it. And tax revenue's gone up, maybe too much tax revenue, but it's a fair, accurate system. So this endless, almost demonization of Putin as a man and almost devilization of Russia itself, it's completely wrong. And so therefore, paradoxically, we also have failed to normalize ourselves. Yes, there's plenty of failings in Russia. I mean, no one for a second would deny all sorts of things, but it's Putin's, whether there's Putinite stability, because Putin's reflecting those four phases of Russian foreign policy. And I can guarantee that whoever comes afterwards, Shmutin or whoever, Putin, Shmutin or Titutin, it will be exactly the same because of great power concerns, not even sphere of influence. Sphere of influence doesn't mean infringing on the sovereignty of your neighbours. It means a system which respects. You have concerns. The United Kingdom has concerns about Ireland next door. I mean, if somebody's going to put missiles in there, I think that we would object.
Thanks very much. You certainly have given us a lot of food for thought. Putin the good man, Putin the good politician being here for a change. Let's open it up to Q&A and see what the questions over there, please.
I don't think he was saying that Putin is a good man.
Yes.
I think he was saying he was a reasonable man and that he feels taken advantage of. I think that this gives me the right to do a little history here. You mentioned, Ambassador Matlock, that you suggested that if Obama had gone to Sochi in 2014 and said to, or that had a chance for Putin to say, look, Ukraine, what do you think about incorporating Ukraine in NATO? That would have maybe changed things. Well, that happened. That exactly happened 6 years before, on the 1st of February 2008, and we know this from the cables from Moscow, released by WikiLeaks, when Lavrov, a brand new foreign minister, called our ambassador, Bill Burns, in and said, Mr. Burns, I understand you are thinking of incorporating Ukraine into NATO. Do you know what "niet" means? This is verbatim, okay? Burns reported it back to Washington and said, Lavrov has just drawn a red line. Just drawn a red line. You've doubled NATO despite your promise to Gorbachev. No more. Ukraine is off the table. 2 months later, Bucharest, NATO summit, April 3, 2008, declaration, Ukraine will become a member of NATO, Georgia too. So, we were filling our oats in those days. That was 2008, and it took till what, 2008, 6 more years, till 2015, when the Assistant Secretary of State, Nuland, bragged and said, we have invested $5 billion in Ukraine's aspirations toward the West. December 2013. February 2014, there was a coup. Now, it was the most blatant coup in history because intercepted were telephone messages en cloud between our ambassador in Kiev and Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary for European Affairs. I'm amazed that people don't know this because it's right there on the record. The coup was plotted the 1st of February, and they didn't change their plans.
Thanks a lot.
On the 22nd.
Thanks a lot. Do you have a question as well?
Yeah, the question would be, the question would be, why is it that we succumb to the depiction of Putin as some kind of demon when we institute a coup, the most blatant coup in history, according to George Friedman of the Stratfor, on the doorstep of Russia. There was no doubt that he would seize Crimea. That's their only water-free port. Why did the United States do that? And why does nobody notice? Has anybody heard of that conversation plotting the coup?
Thank you. Thank you. Let's can we have some answers here?
Well, as I've indicated, I think that the whole idea that we can create democracy for other people is a mistaken one. Senator Fulbright, who was the only senator from the very beginning to vote against the Vietnam War, wrote a book called The Arrogance of Power. And he pointed out that, among other things, you can't make democracy for somebody else. So the whole idea of democracy promotion as an essential part of our foreign policy, which is read by any government which we consider not sufficiently democratic as simply support for the opposition, I think is not only mistaken in concept, but tends to have the opposite effect. And I think this has certainly been true in Russia.
Thank you. Maybe you'll get another question. Yes, please.
Can you wait for the microphone? If Putin is not the malign ogre that he's perceived in the West, how do you rationalize your description of him and Russia's cyber attacks on the American election in 2016 and all the disinformation campaigns that are going on through the IRA.
Which cyber attack in 2016? This is in the DNC having access to it, and of course the purchasing a few Facebook ads. This is exactly symptomatic. The Russiagate alleged interference is, I'm working on this at the moment. I think that ultimately, when you looked at the Mueller report, it didn't show anything substantive. A few purchases. If you remember I think it was Nate Silver, the great American pollster, who said that Russian, the IRA, the St. Petersburg outfit, whether they should be doing it or not is another question. I don't think they should have done it at all, using fake personas. But on the other hand, it was a clickbait exercise. And he said that basically it was like a grain of salt in a salad bowl the size of Madison Square Garden. So it was 0.00001% of the purchasers in the US election of 2016. That's David Stretch, the fellow from Facebook. What effect and so on, we should have these analyses and so on. So I don't think that particular thing. So
But it was more than just
what else?
Affecting the election. It was creating
something Discord.
It was divisive and it created and set the stage for it.
This is the whole point. I just simply can't see what it did. I mean, so in Discord, the US intelligence community assessment of 6th of January 2017 made this assertion. But as we know, this was a hand-picked group. Even the NSA did it with moderate caution with others. And I told them, Gay's written about this and others. So it's, it just doesn't, it was making assertions. But what we do need, and this is very dangerous, and that there was actually almost no intervention whatsoever. The DNC, yes, we had a GRU outfit there, but so there are about half a dozen outfits there. It was just a relatively open. The big question is, how did the stuff get to WikiLeaks and to public domain? Now, and I'd like to know that answer, and I'll be talking to people more about this, because the assertion is that these various cutouts, DC leaks, and so on. So we all know, and Gussifer too. Anyway, I don't go into too much detail, but the big picture is, I think there's a question mark about it, and all the other actions which are alleged, imputed, the assassination, dreadful assassination of journalists and so on, which you look at each individual case, and there are questions over how and why it did. But this isn't to say that Putin is, a knight in shining armor. In fact, the whole book there, which I'm trying to say, is that there's two elements going on in Russia. And the paradox is that Putin, who was trying to re-establish a state, and by that I mean a constitutional state with defensible property rights and independent courts, with a genuinely free and fair competitive elections and all of that, that these things are all circumscribed. These are weakened. This constitutional state is there. It's legalistic, and Putin's very, very legalistic, but it's always overshadowed by this second element, which was established under Yeltsin, where he undermined the democratic revolution. That the 1996 presidential election, when Yeltsin was re-elected for a second term, was a fiddle election. I mean, I don't blame the United States, but there were certainly some US election advisors were involved there. And what I call this administrative regime. There's something outside this power system which stands over and above the Constitution. Usually works through the Constitution, but subverts the spirit of constitutionalism. So that's the big paradox, is that Putin tries to normalize, and in the end, he reproduces Soviet-style behaviors, some malevolent, we can argue the details about it, but some malevolent, undoubtedly, but which reproduces Soviet-style stability, mechanical and not organic, not emerging from the bottom up of genuine free entrepreneurialism, because you have constant state bureaucracy and so on. You know, some places it's better, some places it's worse, because Russia is huge, 85 regions and so on, and depends on the governor and so on. But nevertheless, this is the paradox that after 20 years of Putin's leadership, both, it's not a question simply of blaming external forces. Russia has to take responsibility for its own actions and its own development internally. I mean, obviously a benign foreign environment is always helpful, of course. But ultimately, it's a system which was established in the 1990s, which he then perfected. Elections, therefore, are not fiddled, but they are managed in a way to achieve a regime outcome. But maybe the biggest paradox of it all is that Putin, by allowing this dual system of a genuine constitutional state, because he's very, very legalistic, but suborned and subordinated to the power system, that he has created the conditions, possibly, for a peaceful evolution of a post-Putin Russia to a more genuinely competitive democratic system. But the tragedy would be if we have another democratic revolution which undermines the achievements of the present system. So it's ambivalent at the moment.
So are you saying that the hacking of the computer at the democratic headquarters was not done by Russia, or that Putin didn't know about it? Is that what you're saying?
Well, when you say hacking, I'm not sure what this word means. They were there. Mm-hmm. They were there. They were actually. They were there at least from 2014. I'm certainly identified in 2015. But so this is what they do. The US is I'm sure, in the United Russia headquarters and so on. That's what they do. The issue is whether and how it was weaponized when it came out in June 2016, and how this information, and of course later the Podesta stuff is we can talk about that as well, but the hacking of the election is a meaningless term. And I'd go further. There was a lot of stuff was going on then, and so therefore you have to go into detail. We know that John Brennan and Clapper, NSA and CIA, that these people were engaged in some. Comey, John, what's his first name? Comey. James Comey was the fall guy. I've spoken to a number of US security officials, and they say, well, he was, because of his pomposity and sententiousness and ultimately the way he behaved in a strange way, and he, and obviously gave the election effectively to Trump by opening an investigation on the emails towards the end. But ultimately, Russia wasn't, the hacking was, the answers to the question of how it got there was not in the Mueller report and in any other report. So it's wide open whether and how it was extracted and delivered. Why Mueller did not speak to Julian Assange, who was easily found because he was holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy at that stage, is beyond belief. Very simple, ask him. You say you did not, Assange says, I did not get this stuff from, let us say, GRU. And he says, I know who gave it to us. Craig Murray, our former ambassador to Uzbekistan, UK ambassador. A whole stack of people are telling us that that's not the way it happened. And yet we have an assertion in Mueller, who finds, by the way, there's no collusion or no conspiracy, but there was obstruction, which doesn't give us. He gives us some names of these GRU officers. But these GRU officers, as Scott Ritter has demonstrated, they were taken from a handbook, which easily the US had hacked from the GRU, an internal things. So these are just names in various positions. But again, knowing that these people would never be taken to court, would never be able to say, no, it had nothing to do with me. And some of them have said, no, it had nothing to do with this unit 91576, and so on and so forth. So in other words, it's huge. And so the damage to US democracy was not the alleged Russian hacking. It was the response to it and the failure of the Democratic Party to look up, to really face the reasons why it lost that election in 2016.
All right, thanks very much. Let's ask some more questions. Yeah, over there.
Yeah, there's a microphone, please.
I like the term of the unnecessary Cold War, and I guess I'm interested in the key actions that led to this unnecessary Cold War. Could you two of you identify in each of the administrations, like for example, the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administration, one act that you believe was the most important one that administration did to lead to this unnecessary Cold War?
He asked whether you said, why you said it was an unnecessary Cold War. And can you, give us some examples regarding some administrations?
I think it's unnecessary because I do think that some of these things would not have been happening if our relations had been better. If we had, in the 1990s, actually worked on the premises on which we actually ended the Cold War. Instead, we started acting as if it was not only a military victory, but a justification in trying to impose our system as we theoretically think of it, not as it actually happens, on the rest of the world. And I think that was a huge mistake. I see no reason, if we keep our eye on where the real threats of the future are, that we could not enlist more cooperation from other countries rather than competing with them. Well, why do we insist that we have to control the waters around China, for example, as China becomes more powerful and more capable of doing themselves? How would we like it if the Chinese or the Russians or, for that matter, the British were patrolling our shores all the time? And yet we continued to do that after the Cold War, instead of sitting down and trying to get cooperation on the real issues. And there are such things as global warming, controlling the spread of new diseases, which are going to continue to come up, and so on. Dealing with terrorism, dealing with failed states, dealing with the problems that are going to come from desiccation and other environmental changes that are going to bring huge movements of peoples. We're not facing those, and there's no reason, for us. There has never, ever been any relationship between where the border is between Russia and Ukraine and U.S. security. Why in the world are we making an issue of it now? That's why I say I think it was unnecessary, and I think that the sort of thinking that led us into 2 world wars in the 19th century, which is the geopolitical thinking, we're competing over who controls what, that's going to be a disaster. And I just hope we wake up before it is.
Thank you. Question here.
Earlier you talked about how you believe that we as Americans can't celebrate the victory of the Cold War, winning the Cold War, because we didn't technically win the Cold War. Communism fell, capitalism won, but the Americans. And what do you believe about all the space race and the arms race, American efforts and the democratic efforts to show the global public how ineffective communism really is? Do you think that can contribute to a sense of pride and victory?
Is that for me?
He says, he asks whether the space race and similar technical competition with the Soviet Union, whether that isn't a reason to be proud of.
I think let me say there was a real problem at the end of World War II with the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, the part that they had controlled, and also of the clamping down within the Soviet Union by Stalin. If he had not died when he did, there would have been probably a huge anti-Semitic purge. And so on. It was an evil system. It was an evil empire at that time. I think that the choice then I graduated from Duke in 1950. I was in college between 46 and 50, those sort of first 4 years after the end of World War II. And the big choice then was, well, we better hit the Soviet Union now while they're weak because a war is going to be inevitable. Of course, that would have been an utter disaster. The George Kennan recommendation was, no, that's unnecessary, dangerous, just contain it. Keep it from seeking to justify itself by spreading further. Now, he didn't always agree later with the efforts we made to contain it. But although one can say now that, for example, if we had been, Eisenhower had been more forthcoming when Stalin died in making some sincere offers, maybe we could have avoided some of the things later. But I'm saying that politically, I think we did the best we could to keep the peace on the basis of containment and to keep the hawks who wanted actually to destroy the Soviet Union before it got nuclear weapons or before they got very many. I think that would have been disastrous. So in that sense, the Cold War, by keeping it cold, I think was an achievement. When we got a different government, that is Gorbachev, in the Soviet Union, we were able to end it. Not by defeating them, but by, in effect, finding cooperative ways to end things that were costing us both. After all, the arms race, it was costing them more than it was costing us, but it was a problem, and it still is a problem, because we're putting into the military things that we need for our own infrastructure, education, and so on. So that's a carryover from the Cold War. But I do think that the Cold War was the best we could do politically at that time, and I would emphasize the cold.
Okay, thank you very much. We have, Brian, we have time for a few more questions.
Thank you very much. Professor, can you help me, please? I have now a very confused picture of who Putin is. You have given us an image, this rather handsome, laudatory, admirable man. Now, we did have a talk previously, it was very convincing, of him as being a nefarious, scurrilous, evil, mafia-supported character, supported by a clique of people in Moscow and St. Petersburg. So I must say, I'm not sure how to interpret this painting. Can you give us a clearer picture?
Can I just quickly respond to an earlier question about the mistakes leading on to the... I won't go into the whole stack of them, just one, which people should understand. The US's unilateral abrogation of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, it left in June 2002, is a fundamental factor in many of the things which happened later. And then, of course, the ABM, or ballistic, what we call the ballistic missile defense installations. This is really game-changing stuff. I mean, that was catastrophic. You talk about NATO enlargement, but even deeper, Putin has said this is the key one. And as for the communist thing, at its peak, the Soviet Union was 56% GDP of the United States, and this was in the 1960s at its peak. 56, and then it declined. So the decline was, I always argue, the self-defeat of the Soviet Union, and that was the invasion of Czechoslovakia on the 21st of August, 1968. It was the greatest self-invasion in history because it blocked the evolution, and it was happening, of the Soviet system itself. It became more managerial, repressive in a foolish manner, in a sense it was dysfunctional obviously earlier, but we're talking about it just, against the dissidents and so on, which the sources of innovation, and they clamped down, for example, until the Podgorny-Kosygin reforms, that there were collective farms were being incentivized by elements of the market. What the Chinese did later, brilliantly. And this was all closed down. So in other words, the peasants could sell to the market and then keep some of the money and invest it and so on. So, but after 1968, the end of socialism with a human face, all of that died, and that's because Gorbachev knew those people in Czechoslovakia and used that experience, but when he started doing that, it was 20 years too late. That's a big issue, but it's a good fundamental question. As for Mr. Putin, no, you look at the book, but those pictures of him, I don't recognise him. I've only been studying it for 20 years, reading every single speech and act. But I regard that as that's ideology. It's anti-hagiography. I'm certainly not hagiography. There's plenty of them. The book is entirely, all my works on Putin have been deeply critical of him, but understanding it as normal, rational policy making. Some of his policies have been excellent. Some of them have been very poor. I think that the failure to, how can I put it, that he, at a certain point, shifted. The first term of Putin, 2004, it was extraordinarily liberal. I mean, there was judicial reform and so on. Then the events in Ukraine, the war in Iraq before that, and other events tilted him back to a default position which almost any Russian leader will do. And I don't think it's good, but they do. And that is a country with no defensible borders, which had 11 identifiable major invasions, the last one the Germans, before that the Swedes, the Poles, and so on. National security is always, it doesn't have two oceans on either side. It has borders which are constantly negotiated, will put national security, and this has huge domestic consequences, and therefore he shifted to statism in economic policy. And also the oil and energy wealth meant it wasn't Dutch disease, because they managed the wealth quite well in putting them into sovereign wealth funds, managed largely to avoid the Dutch disease, not bad policy making by the way, and increasing the capacity of the state to collect revenues and then to invest that into. So Russia today is a full service economy. Patrick Armstrong, my colleague from Canada, keeps saying this. It's got shipbuilding, it's got aircraft building, a very highly developed defense industry. It's got some. As for the Putin crony thing, I mean, it leads to very bad policy making, sanctions, squeeze some of the so-called oligarchs, and you read the US press that Deripaska and all these others are Putin's mates. They hardly ever meet. Putin humiliated Deripaska, if you remember, in 2009 in Pikolova. So, you know, a mate isn't his mate. It's this idea of kleptocracy, Putin's cronies, is nonsense. I work with these people. Vladimir Yakunin, for example, the head of Russian railways. You know, it's just simply, yes, he has colleagues and people whom he trusts and work with. One of them, and in fact the biggest one lately, and it's always been, is Alexei Kudrin, a liberal, who is now head of the audit chamber. And in fact, just reading Vedomosti this morning, it was quite clear that it was a big article on this. And, you know, he could well be the successor, by the way. So Alexei Kudrin, a classic economic liberal, whom Putin respects. They meet nowadays, in this article was saying, almost on, you know, every few days. And I just don't recognise this language, you know, of this person this nonsense, which was talked about in nefarious and kleptocracy, carrying Dawisha stuff and so on. It's just simply, and it's dangerous because it leads to fundamentally flawed policy making. I mean, Russia is not an adversary, but it is an independent power, which is critically, and it will, Putin made this very moving at his speech, 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz in Israel. He said, let's talk, you know, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, let's get together. Now, you know, he was talking for a restoration of this word. And I mean, we've all forgotten it, but I'll remember it begins with a D, and it's called diplomacy, the sort of excellent diplomacy that Ambassador Matlock did, which brought a peaceful end to the Cold War. That's not gone. It's now simply been replaced by vilification, denunciation, demonization. It's just crazy. I simply can't stand it. And it shows the pathologies of that post-Cold War syndrome with which I talk about. I mean, I haven't got time. I just say very briefly, you know, the big picture is, at the end of the Cold War, there was two models, New World Order 1 or New World Order 2. New World Order 1 is the one we've got, which is simply the enlargement of a system which has failed to renew itself in conditions of post-Cold War, end of the Cold War, and in the sense in which it constantly reproduced the logic of conflict and demonization.
But isn't that slightly a too benign picture? Well, I'm sure there is something in what you say, but you know, we still have the oppression of the opposition in Russia and the persecution of journalists, including death. We have the bombing of civilian targets, Aleppo in Syria, done actively by the Russian Air Force. These are not military targets, these are civilian targets. You know, we cannot just ignore that. While I'm sure what you say, some of that is, you know, perfectly fine, but there is a much less benign picture consisting of what I've just said. How do you bring it all together?
Yeah, on the Aleppo, in the liberation of Raqqa, the headquarters of Daesh, between 15 and 25,000 civilians were killed. Every single hospital, school, and so on was destroyed. Ditto earlier in Mosul. Why don't we talk about this? What we have in Aleppo...
I'm sure you're right. We should talk about that as well. We should also talk about the American invasion of Iraq, which is totally wrong. But I think it is not fair to deflect from Russian behavior to simply say others also did bad things.
No.
Granted. Absolutely. I'm not saying the Americans or the British or the French are better than the Russians, vice versa. But let's focus on Russia and Putin's action. So the targeting of civilian targets, hospitals in Aleppo, in Syria, and many other cities is a fact. And you know, one cannot deflect from that by pointing to other countries who also did bad things.
Yeah, I'm sure it's happened. What we also have are the so-called white helmets, which have been very active in putting forwards a particular vision of it. Two-thirds of Aleppo was in, I'm not defending Assad regime, in not defending it, other than saying it's a legitimate government, however odious it may be. Two-thirds of Aleppo was in government hands. Life went on fine. But the white helmets had an extraordinary ability to be precisely, never ever to identify the enemy, you know, what was going on, the various nasty forces, and then would suddenly say this hospital was. I no doubt some hospitals were attacked. I'm not, I don't see the Russian military would specifically go out to target these hospitals, and therefore it's exactly this extraordinary Cold War culture of distorting these pictures. It's a terrible war. No question about it, and so on. As for the domestic stuff, I don't recognise what you're saying, because if you give me examples of, you say the persecution of the opposition. Now, the opposition is very active. In the last presidential election, there was a whole sweep of candidates. You had Ksenia Sobchak, the daughter of Anatoly Sobchak. She was there. You had Grigory Yavlinsky, my friend, who stood, and people, if they'd wanted to vote for these people, they could. They didn't want to vote for them because they had nothing to offer. And therefore, and as for the journalists, the number of journalists who've been killed in Russia has fallen dramatically from what it was in the 1990s. So,
But no journalists should be killed.
They shouldn't be killed at all. No, absolutely not. But look at the circumstances. In Dagestan, it's certainly, Dagestan has now, lately, I don't think, to my knowledge, it hasn't been anything. We're talking about Olga, what's her name, the one in 2007. In Dagestan, in Chechnya. Chechnya, of course, is one of those great, it's a constitutional black hole. It's been brought in, and we know Ramzan Kadyrov is, the anti-gay attacks, dreadful. But, for example, the death of Boris Nemtsov on the 27th of February 2015, one of the oppositionists to death. I went to lay flowers where he was murdered on the Zamoskvoye Mosque bridge just outside the Kremlin. And as soon as I saw the exact spot, which I hadn't twigged until I went to see it, that it was literally the closest spot to the corner of the Kremlin walls. And then I immediately, anybody who sees that, it's an obvious signal. And the signal was, I'm 99% sure, it was, I won't name a name, but it was a Chechen forces. And if you remember what Putin did afterwards, he disappeared for 2.5 weeks. And basically, Putin was talking in conclave with some of his people whether to launch a third Chechen war. Now, because the point is, earlier in 2015, there'd been the Russian security services don't like Kadyrov in Chechnya. They don't like it. They can't exercise control there. So there had been almost a standoff and almost a fighting there, and they were pushing for the overthrow of Kadyrov. Kadyrov then murders Nemtsov, and I will say this with all responsibility, Putin does not murder his opponents. That in this case it was, they killed Nemtsov as a warning. If you go for us in Chechnya, this is what's going to happen. And it had the advantage of getting somebody who said, I know that Putin and Nemtsov, I've seen them together. So it's not the way it works. I mean, Putin is respectful for these people. But anyway, in my view, Putin took the right decision not to launch a third Chechen war. I don't know whether people have seen Grozny, the capital, which has been absolutely destroyed in the first two wars. Today, if you go to Grozny, it's been rebuilt with, I must say, Putin Avenue, shining, gleaming skyscrapers, children going to school, a picture of normality. It is not normal because of that dual system I talked about. Far from normal.
At the same time, right?
Wait, what?
In Grozny, homosexuals have been...
Yes, I'm just saying, he did that. There's been dreadful attacks on gay community in Grozny. It's now started again.
Into this picture.
Yes.
Thank you.
However, a question now maybe.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Wonderful, useful, abstract nouns are being dropped, descriptive as helpful as they are. How about adding one more? The C word, corruption. And if we talk about this new Cold War, and again, helpful as it seems, should we not admit to this conversation this very simple fact that Putin's Russia is a client state. Client state of the United States of America, of the European Union to a certain extent, of England, of course. You come from Britain and here, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about when I say that if you go to Knightsbridge, there are so many Russian officials living there with all their permanent residences. We are in the state of North Carolina. The former head of Russia's army proprietors acquisition services was caught here ordering a hit job on his lover's wife, now a resident of the city of Oaks, Florida. Now this is something that goes on. At the same time, when there is this talk of a new Cold War, old Cold War, at the same time, this is a profoundly corrupt state. Right? That's something that needs to be, I think, admitted into this conversation if we're trying to explain this Putin's paradox, right? And please, different conversation, and I'm about to finish. Yesterday, a few boys from Gaza were condemned to life in prison, 18-year-old sentences, after being tortured with electroshocks appended to their genitals, right? This is the face of Putin's regime. Is this what you see when you go to all these Valdai conferences? How about admitting that part of that reality?
Okay, thank you. Let's ask Richard to respond.
I think you're absolutely right, and thank you very much for raising these issues. It's a society, though I would slightly change the accent a little bit and say that Russia is, it's a society with deep corruption, though I think it's going too far. In fact, it's a category mistake to say it is a corrupt society. It has deep corruption, and in the book I talk about it as a third state, in which you have officialdom, which merges then with criminal gangs, which also with endless factionalism within the security service, who really hate each other more than they hate anybody else. So-called Siloviki, and therefore in the ideology of Upper Italy, the guardianship tradition. So yes, absolutely, that corruption is a fundamental problem. And Putin, for example, which sign of his powerlessness almost in dealing with this, his plaintive cries, for example, at two successive State of the Nation speeches, Poslania, in which he says about the imprisonment of business people, tens of thousands of them, but very few actually taken to court, and it's part of the register the way that their property is stolen. Absolutely. And as this Penza case, as far as I can see, is an absolutely travesty of justice, which should be condemned, absolutely. But again, these cases are dreadful. But, you know, there's dreadful cases, I mean, they're not to justify it for the slightest. I don't, and I condemn it. I condemn also the anti-gay activities of Kadyrov in Chechnya. But if you are sitting in Moscow, should we start a third Chechen war? I don't think so. What you now have is a stabilization in Chechnya. It's far from normal, far from normal. And as Penza, you do have a security apparatus which is highly factionalized, and I don't know what was going on in Penza. I have a feeling like the Golunov case last year, dreadful. But in the end, you know, because of the journalists showed solidarity and he was released, and now those who started that are put on trial. So Russia has, you know, all sorts of cross-cutting elements and, you know, dreadful things. You know, you could even say the penitentiary system is still savage and still sunk in a retributional Soviet mentality. Yet the prison population in Russia has fallen from when Putin came to power, 800,000 to just over, well, I think about 450,000 now, because of the, you know, the fewer draconian laws. Some big mistakes. I think that the war on drugs in Russia is as misconstrued as in many Western countries, and it's hidden the AIDS epidemic, and Russia is still rampant. So we could go through the list of negatives, and it's in all my works, I never hide it. So just like in the United States, and it doesn't justify anything, but just to say countries have major problems, and Russia has. And what you have with Putin is a certain stabilization. There's a long way to go, and if you know, these cases in Penza, I think it's dreadful. Absolutely dreadful.
Thank you very much. We are long overgrown. This has been a very exciting conversation. I would like to finish by asking one final question to both of our speakers. That is simply the question, what is the future for Vladimir Putin? Will he stand and run again? Will he be with us in 10 years' time, still as leader of Russia, or will he gracefully retire soon? What do you think, Ambassador Matlock?
I have a standard answer to questions about the future, and that is that I have no idea what's going to happen.
That's the reason why I asked it.
I will explain why it was inevitable.
Often, me too. This the 2024 question is the 65,000 ruble question, very much so. And the 15th of January, Poslania State of the Nation speech and the constitutional reforms have been variously interpreted. One way is that it was a way of Putin to stay in forever. I don't think so. I think that the signals are that Putin will leave in 2024 at the end of his two constitutionally mandated terms. He will certainly try to establish favourable circumstances for let's put it in a more neutral terms, that the Putinite settlement, with all of its flaws and all of its achievements, will be perpetuated. And I would say that's not a bad option. That, you know, it could be Kudrin, could be Mishustin, could be anybody, we don't know, some dark horse. But the constitutional reform doesn't really change things too much. The State Council, I think, is not going to be, I mean, he may go to some honorary position, Deng Xiaoping type, or Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev, or position, Lee Kuan Yew position. I'm not sure about this. You know, we know that Putin was, at one moment, if it hadn't been for Libya, there was talk of allowing Medvedev a second term. A lot of people bought into it, and so now I know he won't be there. But you cannot build policy, because almost certainly the leader will be less flexible and probably having to prove themselves tough against the West. So if we want to put an end to the second Cold War, now's as good a time as ever to do it.
Thank you very much for all your insights. Ambassador Matlock, Professor Sakwa. Thank you very much. And thank you for staying with us for so long. This was the longest session we've ever had. Let me just remind you, our next event is on the 25th of February, and then we will have a roundtable on the Middle East, another explosive topic. And I hope you will be able to come back on the 25th of February. Thank you and good night.